Levels. From here, Alfred led forth his troops to defeat the invaders and turn back the Danish tide, which threatened to overrun his country. Attempts to tame the Moors began in the Middle Ages, when the abbots of Glastonbury and the bishops of Bath and Wells, the greatest powers in the area, started to divide and drain the land, the very first steps in the gradual transformation of this landscape. Even today, if the rivers and ditches were not continuously cleared and maintained, the land would revert to the bog it once was. A year's accumulation of vegetation or silt could seriously restrict their flow, for the fall on the main rivers of the Levels, the Parrot, the Yoe, the Brew and the Axe, is very slight as they approach the sea, often as little as 1 foot per mile. The Wessex Water Authority, which masterminds these operations, has developed a system of sluices, sluices and locks, which can largely control the level of water in the reens and rivers. Mr. Locke, who inevitably minds the lock at Oath, keeps a watchful eye on the River Parrot.
I've been lockkeeper here ever since 1927. And I lived in the cottage ever since. They've been going to put electric there ever since I've been here. Didn't come yet. If we get a lot of rain, we got to put them up. I don't say right up all the time. Part ways. It's all according to water come down. Then the rain we get here is what we get miles up. We mightn't get no rain here. Then in the night, the water will come down. I had to get up middle of the night. I know I've been in bed, and she said, hark at that water going over the top. I had to come down. And we could feel the vibration of the water. Oh, we shan't see the floods again. Not like that. Because we got the pumps now, you see. Yes.
The introduction of pumps to the moors revolutionized their drainage. Before them, gravity only determined where the waters would flow. Although the first steam pump was installed in 1835, whole-scale pumping did not get underway till the 1940s. People here liking a little time to adjust to new ideas. Now there are over 20 pumping stations. They pump water off the fields and into the high-embanked rivers and relief channels. Only when these are full to the brim do the pumps stop, and then the water is allowed to run over the banks and onto the moors, where it is contained. The farmers used to welcome the winter floods, the silt-rich waters annually refreshing the fields like a layer of high-quality manure. The purpose of all this pumping and draining is to make the moors into productive farmland, for agriculture is by far the most important activity here, and the moors have one of the highest densities of dairy cattle in England. Since these moors were frequently underwater for months on end, houses were often built along the ancient flood walls themselves, and most farms and villages are off the low-lying land on little islands of higher ground. Because of the way in which the land was handed out when the moors were enclosed and drained in the 18th century, farmers have inherited fields that may be scattered many miles apart across the moors. To overcome the problem of having to bring their cows a considerable distance back to the farm to be milked every day, they have developed portable milking bales, which they can move from field to field with their cattle.
Come on, ho, 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 ho!
Hundreds of years before the moors were drained, farmers and herdsmen would drive their animals onto the rich pasture after the spring floods had receded. The word Somerset itself probably derives from them. They were the summer settlers. Cattle shelter under the willow trees that lean protectively over the reeds, holding their banks, giving substance to the soft, peaty soil, and breaking the winds which blow fiercely across the open moors. Most of the native species of this water-loving tree grow here, to many the very symbol of the moors. Some are taken for the timber of their trunks, like the bat willow used for cricket bats, but most are pollarded, the young shoots used for hurdle making or basket work. Here they are called withy trees. On the southern moors, fields of willow wands, withies, are grown for basket making. The withies thrive in the wet conditions, happily standing with their feet in water for many weeks, where other crops would fail. They are cut as an annual crop, shooting up from clumps or stools as much as 8 or 9 feet high. Cutting the withies is back-breaking work, done in the cruelest months of the year after leaf fall. Once cut, they are bundled together and left in stacks till they can be taken from the fields. Before the withies are ready for the basket maker, they have to be prepared. Most of them are thrown into a great tank of boiling water and cooked continuously for 8 hours. This boiling process releases the tannins in the wood and turns the wands a rich golden brown. The sweet, pungent smell from them hangs in the air over the villages of Western Zoyland, Boroughbridge and Stave, puzzling the unaccustomed nose. While still warm, the withies are taken out and stripped of their bark to reveal the shiny rods beneath, now called buffs. After stripping, the withies are dried, sorted by size, and then tied into bundles ready for the basket maker.
When I started off, it was making eel traps, because a chap I used to work with, we was working on the moors, and we used to make these eel traps for catching in the ditches, the drainage ditches. One time you could get what we used to call the old new kind. It was a good one for staking. They were straight and they would border down nice. The black mole, that's the most common withy and the best all-round working withy. And then there was one we called champion rod, black Spaniard, Wissington, and then there was an osier. Well, they used them for agricultural work and used them with the skin on. They never peeled them. They use them for hurdling now. But today, a lot of the old beds is gone. One time in West Sedgemoor, there must have been more than 1,000 acres of withies. Just in West Sedgemoor, Wickmore, all up around that part. There used to be so much hand labour in them, but those days a withy bed would last for up to 50 years because you did the weeding by hand. But today, you know, you can't do it, the wages wouldn't warrant it. There's so much work attached to it.
Withy work still provides local people with a living, though few young men now take it on.
Now, you all know that the course we're here to study this time is ecology, and in particular, the ecology of our own area. Some people call it Sedgemoor, but nowadays it's often called the Somerset Levels. Now, let's just think for a minute. Suppose that's the land level, and that's the water underneath it. Let's say that's 2 feet, just for the sake of argument. How long is a snipe's beak? All right, 3, 4, 5 inches. That's about the length of waders. I think a curlew's a bit longer, but that's the sort of distance we're talking about. So if that's the beak there, that's, say, 3 or 4 inches, the food is scattered anywhere in here, isn't it? But what will happen in winter when the water level rises until it's eventually, let's say, there? What will happen to all the worms and all the soil creatures? Yeah? They'll rise with it. So they'll all be jammed in there, won't they? So that will be, you know, just like a sort of self-service counter for those birds. You know, straight in and a beakful every time. So it's great for the waders.
Bernard Storer, author of A Natural History of Sedgemoor, takes his class out onto the moors where they can get involved in the work of the Somerset Trust at its nature reserve on Catcott. Here, parts of the reserve are deliberately kept in a primal or natural state, and others are managed in various ways to show how different kinds of farming practice can radically alter the ecology of the area.
To start with, a lot of these pinky white flowers, these are called marsh valerian. You can see the purple flowers, spikes of them everywhere. Those are marsh orchids. We've got the ordinary common thistle coming in. You can see those. But again, we've got, it doesn't have marsh name, but it's called the meadow thistle, and that's this one down here with these rather silvery grey leaves, and it's much less spiky than the others.
This reserve illustrates how the moors have evolved as a result of man's interference, how the activities of the farmers on the moors have determined the present nature of the place, and how they continue to change it.
Here we've got an example of the modern way of cleaning the ditches. They're done by machine. The ditches, of course, are much deeper, but the main problem from a wildlife point of view, of course, is that the ditch banks have to be kept nice and clean, and therefore there is a loss of the wild plants that would normally have grown on the banks of the ditches. This is a fairly wet field, obviously, and if you look back at the ditch there, you can see the water table is just below the surface, so all the insect life in this soil is going to be in the top few inches. That's very important for those winter waders. Remember what we were saying, the high water table means that all the insect life in the soil is squeezed up in the top few inches, and they can then reach it, and this to them is an absolutely superb sort of dinner table.
smaller ones. Got the bigger worms? Push the back out closer, Mike.
You want to
That's right
be...
there. That's right, hold in there.
Oh, done.
Eels hide within the dark waters of the River Parrot.
Out a bit further, no?
These strange migratory creatures, much of whose life cycle remains a mystery, are thought to have swum over 4,000 miles from the weed-filled Sargasso Sea and taken 2 years in the voyage.
In the bath, sway a bit, Mike.
However, even the eel, with all its secrets, is no match for man and his technology.
Beauty.
No, keep him out there, Mike. Keep him out beside the bath.
Ray ballers, or eel plotters, artfully pursue the eel, which loves to live along the slimy bottoms of the waterways, providing the locals with keen sport.
Trying hard.
What a lovely player. Lovely ball. Many. Come on in. 4 and 5.
You're on. My shot? Yeah.
127 then. Go on, Rod, show us. Rubber. Go on, boy. In there. Get her on.
We win third.
Sticker's got 55 pence to pay. Shot!
I got 9 here. I got 9 here.
During the high tides of spring, as darkness falls over the moors, the elverers emerge. They line the muddy banks of the river and scoop out the elvers, the young eels, which struggle up the estuary of the River Parrot on their way to the fresh waters of the ditches and reeds, where they fatten and grow.
Not much better. There's the reef there. No, they are. Oh, look. See, look at that, man. Look. No. Oh, good fish. Good golden roach, that time. Leave him. Gotta chuck him in, Mark. Yeah, I will, Mark. Oh. Where is he? Oh, he's the lush one. Oh, golden roach. Don't touch that. Oh. Tell it.
These tiny, translucent creatures swim up the rivers in their thousands. So frail and small, it seems impossible they should have swum across the ocean. Many of the elvers are sold to stock eel farms. Others go frozen to Japan and France, where they are eaten as a delicacy. The traditional way to eat them here is to fry them in an omelette, though some, it is said, pour them live into pint beer mugs and swallow them whole.
On a wooden sled designed by his forefathers, a fisherman of Stolford crosses the mudflats of Bridgewater Bay. It's a 3-hour journey which no man of his family has missed for 300 years at low tide between May and December. The Sellicks, the brewers. They bear time-honored names long known among the fisherfolk of Somerset. The framework of their sleds is hung with the simple gear of the shrimp fishers of Stolford.
"30 years later, Tony Brewer still uses the sledge to make the journey across the mud of Bridgewater Bay. These great expanses of mud, deposited by the silt-rich rivers of the Levels, lie where there was once dry land. Stumps of trees appear miles from the shore, the last remnants of an ancient forest. It is a race against the tide, which can turn with frightening speed, and the depredations of the gulls, which tear at the fish stranded conveniently in the nets.
It's roughly 2 mile out where my nets are, and on a good day I can do it in 20 minutes, and on a bad day, no knowing what time it to take. If you got a big high tide, you got approximately 4.5 hours, but if you got a low tide, you only got an hour to work. But on average, there's about we go 2 hours to low water, and that gives us about 3 hours to do our work in out there. Since Inkley Point been there, the power station that is, our catches have gone down, and I believe they'd be the cause of it was reclaiming 12 acres of land, altering the current. There's millions of gallons of water going in, millions of gallons of water going out, and the sound of the machinery travelling through the water, frightening the fish off, because we don't catch quarter of what we used to catch when I was a boy. The nets used to be bung right up with shrimps, and you had bigger shrimps as well. And whereas we was using 48 nets today, we used to have about 30 when we started with Father. And it's been unknown in the last few years to have as many as 70 out there in the peak of the season, and then still not catching what we used to catch years ago. Went with my father first. He told me all the different names of the places where the nets are, and the first lot is the 14 raft, the next lot is Father's 7, the next lot is the long raft, and the ones furthest out, that's Irby's ground.
When the shrimps and fish have been loaded onto the sledge, Tony Brewer must push his way over the mud towards home, where his catch is prepared for the market. The family helps sort through the catch. The fish and eels have to be cleaned, the shrimps boiled while still alive. Now there are only 2 mud horsemen left, one brewer and one Selick, and little prospect that future generations will follow them. Six and a half thousand years ago, when the sea retreated from the Somerset Levels, it left behind a brackish swamp. Plants grew, colonized the swamp, and formed a dense mat of vegetation, which turned eventually to peat. Over the millennia, the level of the land gradually rose. As the climate changed, the peat bogs continued to grow, until about the time the Romans left Britain. Deep furrows raked across the landscape now mark the passage of the peat extractors. Ruckles of drying peat turves stretch across the fields in summer. Before the last war, peat was cut for fuel, and smallholders with rights on the moors would hawk their turves around the towns. But now, since the discovery of its uses in horticulture, it's mostly sold to the garden centres and the insatiable compost-conscious public. The industry generates work and money for many local people. Behind every pile of peat, there stands a family business. Demand shows no sign of slackening. Since the war, the introduction of machinery has hugely accelerated the large-scale extraction of peat and created some conflicts yet to be resolved. The peat companies, the farmers, the archaeologists, and the conservationists all have a stake in the future of this area. Stacking the peat in ruckles to dry must still be done by hand. Digging by hand, though, has all but died out. Only the head, the end of the line where the machine can't turn, needs still to be taken out with knife and spade. Each block of peat, or mump, weighs about 2 stone. 50 years ago, teams of men would work like this all day long.
When I started digging peat, that was the only trade there was in the village, which all the village used to work on the peat at that time for Alexanders and everybody else, and there could have been up to 50 pairs of diggers working there. It was hard work, but people wanted a job, and that's what they used to do, dig turds. And it was done on a piecework basis, and the more you dig, the more you could earn. But of course, now the machinery have come in. All you need a odd digger now and again to dig the ends out where the machine can't finish off to. Before the hay knife came about, they used what they called a turf scythe, which they used to mark and dig with the same tool. But now, since hay knife and that came about, they use a hay knife and a spade. But the spade must be pulled up a little bit for your own comfort and easy working. And of course, then you've got your shovel, a mowing scythe, got your marking stick, got a chopper. By the time finished up, you've got about 8 tools you'll use on digging peat.
Cheap hand labour allowed the industry to flourish in the days before the machines, and the wealth of the area depended upon it. Even today, an acre of good deep peat can fetch as much as £8,000. It's a strange, insubstantial part of the world. Roads tend to move around. Buildings have a certain instability. But peat has one very special quality, for within it, much is preserved. Archaeologists have revealed a record of man's activities on the moors back through 6,000 years. The most important of their finds are a series of wooden roads, or trackways. It was a peat digger, a Mr. Sweet, who first came across what is considered to be one of the oldest man-made roads in the world, now named the Sweet Track. It's 5,000 years old. Sadly, the Sweet Track has started to disintegrate. The lowering of the water table for modern agriculture dries out the peat and threatens future finds. These trackways give many clues to the Neolithic people who built them and to their efforts in keeping communications open between the settlements as the climate changed and the peat bogs grew. Eventually, it seems, conditions grew so wet that the people here went about mainly by boat. These moors to the north of the Polden Hills have an altogether different air from the southern moors. Here the moors are wider and less well trod, the villages further apart, the farms more often like temporary encampments. They retain a certain prehistoric air. For many across the moors, old methods are slow to change.
You know, go. Here, hang. Come on. Out there. Come on. Come on. Okay. Come on. All right.
For every progressive farmer, there are more who farm in a willfully traditional way. Farmers like Mr. Derman remain till now relatively untouched by the forces which have transformed so much of our countryside.
How was that?
Many of the small farms on the moors have hardly been affected by the revolution in farm management over the last few decades. The massive increases in the application of fertilizers and pesticides, the increased reliance upon technology, or the reclamation of marginal land. Most of the farms here are comparatively small. The average size under 100 acres, many of them 50 or less.
At the moment, I'm milking 12 cows. Got about 14 followers, 31 head altogether. I find that 12 milking by hand all the time, nearly all the time myself, is about enough. Especially when they're full yields. It's plenty enough to say 40, 45 gallons a day is enough for one to milk out by hand, in my opinion. I do enjoy milking them by hand. You know, I can't say that time matters. That doesn't bother me. Time's my own. I mean, there's a nice quiet cow sitting on you can relax, and only got the cow you're milking to worry about.
Although farmers like George David are becoming rare, there are still many on the moors who practice a mixed kind of farming economy, digging peat or cutting withies, as well as keeping sheep and cattle. But the economic scales are not balanced in favor of the small farmer. And the social fabric of rural life is being transformed along with the landscape itself. The traditional pattern of farming on the moors is now rapidly changing, and the key to that change is drainage. By digging deeper and straighter reams, installing field pumps and deep underfield drains, the water table can be lowered and kept well below the surface, and any excess water taken off the fields with greater speed. Such drainage schemes give farmers the opportunity to replace the old pasture ideally suited to the wet and sow arable crops, or more commonly, improved high-protein grasses, which give a greater milk yield, but which would not survive waterlogged conditions. Once the possibilities opened up by improved drainage were demonstrated by a handful of pioneering progressive farmers, drainage has gone on apace. There have always been arguments about land usage on the levels, and the draining of the moors has encountered opposition from others interested in the countryside.
He does get a equitable compensation for...
A series of meetings organised by the Somerset County Council has brought the opposing factions face to face.
Section 28 of the Wildlife Act, the protection to wildlife has been extended quite considerably, and it does mean that a level of consultation is required from owners if they wish to carry out a list of specified operations that could damage the wildlife.
The Nature Conservancy Council has identified sites of special scientific interest on the moors, covering some 16,000 acres out of a total of 140,000 acres. This 16,000 acres is seen by the NCC as a bare minimum of land needed for the protection of wildlife on the moors. The National Farmers Union thinks this far too large an area. To a farmer who has land within an SSSI, the whole arrangement smacks of an insensitive and ignorant bureaucracy, trying to tie his hands and prevent him from expanding his business. Indeed, threatening his...
You feel it? Well, that's because what you're standing on is a great mass of waterlogged peat, which in the middle of the moor is said to be about 15 to 20 feet deep. There are any amount of good grassy fields all over the country, but here you've just got these few left which are good for the birds and the flowers, and that's what we're aiming to save. It's costing us quite a lot of money. We've already spent over £500,000 on our 500 acres, but we think it's worthwhile, and we hope that when you grow up it will still be here for you to come and look at and to bring your children to see.
Does this hope offer a real vision of the future for the moors? Or does it, as many of the farmers who live and work here claim, turn the moors into a museum? The moors and levels have evolved to their present condition only because of man's considerable activities here over the centuries. At what point should that evolution be stopped?